Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Myself, Keshav Murthy, Assistant Professor, Dibonomias College of Commerce and Arts. Today, I am going to teach you uh, the daffodils written by William Wordsworth. The poem prescribed for you for first BA language, English language. Wait a minute. So, the daffodils written by William Wordsworth. First, we are going to I give a brief introduction about the author William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born on April 7th, 1770, in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England. So, young William Wordsworth's parents, John and his mother, Anne, during his boyhood, he raised amid the mountains of Cumberland alongside the river Derwent. Wordsworth grew in a rustic society and spent a great deal of his time playing outdoors in what he would later remember as a pure communion with nature. So, in the early 1790s, Wordsworth lived for a time in France. Then, the grip of the violent revolution, Wordsworth's philosophical sympathies lay with the revolutionaries, but his loyalties lay with England, whose monarchy he was not prepared to see the overthrown. While in France, Wordsworth had a long affair with Annette Velan, with whom he had a daughter, Caroline. A later journey to France to meet Caroline, now a young girl, would inspire the great sonnet. It's a beauteous evening, calm and free. So, freed from financial worries by a legacy left to him in 1795, Wordsworth moved with his sister Dorothy to Racedown and then to Alfoxden in Gasmere, where Wordsworth could be closer to his friend and fellow poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a great poet called S.T. Coleridge. Together with Wordsworth and Coleridge began to work on a book called Lyrical Ballads, one of the greatest works of Wordsworth and Coleridge. It was first published in 1798 and reissued with Wordsworth's Monument Monument Preface. The publication of lyrical ballads represents a landmark moment for English poetry. It was unlike anything that had come before and paved the way for everything that has come after. According to the theory that poetry resulted from the spontaneous overflow of emotions, as Wordsworth, it was the definition of the poetry. And the poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings which recollected in tranquility. So the definition was gave by a great scholar William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth wrote in the preface, Wordsworth and Coleridge made it their task to write in the simple language of common people. So, telling concrete stories of their lives according to the theory, poetry originated in emotion, recollected in a state of the poetry is the emotion recollected in a state of tranquility. Wordsworth monumental poetic legacy rests on a large number of important poems varying in length and weight from the short, simple lyrics of the 1790s to the vast expanses of the prelude, 13 books long in its 1808 edition. But Wordsworth, adhering largely to the tenets, Wordsworth set out himself in the 1802 preface to lyrical ballads. Wordsworth argues that poetry should be written in the natural language of common speech rather than in the lofty and elaborate dictions that were then considered poetic. He argues that poetry should offer access to the emotions contained in memory, and he argues that the first principle of poetry should be pleasure, that the chief duty of the poetry is to provide pleasure. The chief duty of the poetry to provide pleasure through a rhythmic and beautiful expressions of feeling for all human sympathy. He claims is based on the subtle pleasure principle that is the naked and native dignity of man. Wordsworth poems initiated the Romantic era by emphasizing feeling, instinct, and pleasure above formality and mannerism. More than any poet before him, Wordsworth gave expression to the inchoate human emotions. His lyric strange fits of fashion have I known, in which the speaker describes an inexplicable fantasy he once had that his lover was dead, could not have been written by any previous poet. Curiously, for a poet whose work points so directly toward the future, many of William Wordsworth's important works are preoccupied with the lost of glory of the past, not only of the lost dreams of childhood, but also of the historical past, as in the powerful sonnet London, written in 1802, in which the speaker exalts the spirit of the century's dead poet John Milton to teach the modern world a better way. It is the brief introduction about William Wordsworth. Now I am going to read the poem, prescribed poem, The Daffodils, written by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Besides the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in springly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gauged and gauged, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. And dances with the daffodils. So here, I wandered lonely as a cloud. The beginning line says, the speaker says that wandering like a cloud, floating above hills and valleys. Wandering like a cloud, floating above hills and valleys, he encountered a field of daffodils beside a lake. The dancing, fluttering flowers stretched endlessly along the shore, and though the waves of the lake danced beside the flowers. The daffodils outdid the water in glee. The speaker says that a poet could not help but be happy in such a joyful company of flowers. The speaker says that the poet could not help but be happy in such a joyful company of flowers. Joyful company of flowers. He says that, the poet says that he stared and stared but did not realize what wealth the scene would be bring him. For now, whenever he feels vacant or pensive, the memory flashes upon that inward high, that is the bliss of solitude, and his heart fills with pleasure and dances with daffodils. Dances with daffodils. So, this is a simple poem, one of the earliest and most famous in the Wordsworth canon, revisits the familiar subjects of nature and memory, this time with a particularly spare musical eloquence. The plot is extremely simple, depicting the poet's wandering and his discovery of a field of daffodils by a lake, the memory of which pleases him and comforts him when he is lonely, bored, or restless. The characterization of the sudden occurrence of a memory, the daffodils flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, is psychologically acute. But the poem's main brilliance lies in the reverse personification of its early stanzas. The speaker is metaphorically compared to a natural object, a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high, and the daffodils are continually personified as human beings dancing and tossing their heads, dancing and tossing their heads in a crowd. A host, the technique simply implies the inherent unity between man and nature, making it one of Wordsworth's most basic and effective methods for instilling in the reader the feeling the poet so often describes himself as experiencing. Describe himself as experiencing. So, in the first stanza, the poem is based on the actual incident. Wordsworth had actually seen the breathtaking scene of thousands of daffodils tossing their heads in breeze, but it was only after 2 years that he recollected the scene and wrote this poem. It tells the story, which also is recorded by Dorothy Wordsworth, his sister, in a journal of Wordsworth coming upon hundreds of daffodils while walking in the Lake District. It shows Wordsworth in his pure and prime spirit. You see all those Wordsworthian characteristics which attract some readers and bore others. Some even find it exciting since it narrates the experience of being surprised by joy. Wordsworth described the extent of joy he felt in the company of the daffodils. He felt in the company of the daffodils. In the first stanza of the poem, in the first stanza, I wandered lonely as cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw crowd, a host of relatives, a host of one saw a host of golden daffodils, golden daffodils. So in this stanza, Wordsworth describes, and he was wandering aimlessly around the mountains and vales. He compares him with a cloud which floats over hills and valleys. Suddenly, he sees a large number of daffodils. The daffodils are golden in color. They are stretched by the side of a lake and under the trees. The flowers are swaying with the wind and seem to be dancing merrily. Dancing merrily or happily. Merrily me or happily. So we should notice that the poet compares himself with cloud. This kind of comparison is called simile. Here, poet thinks that of himself like a cloud in the sense of being free of movement, free to rejoice in whatever his wandering offers him. The smile may also suggest the element of surprise at his unexpected discovery of the daffodils. As mentioned earlier, Wordsworth has witnessed this scene 2 years ago. In this poem, he is recollecting the scene. Therefore, the stanza stresses two ideas first. The role of memory is enabling us to feel and understand the world around us. And secondly, the enduring influence of nature on man, the beautiful sight that delighted the poet when he actually saw it, but a recollection of the scenes gave him to feeling and understanding which he neither felt nor understood when the actual event took place. Thus, it is memory which brings things closer and enables him to establish contact with nature. So, secondly, nature can exercise her influence over man even through recollection and delight him. Loneliness of the poet is insisted upon. It forms a sharp contrast with daffodils. They are a host of crowd. Is also owing to sudden visual shook of the daffodils that brings him down the earth from up to the clouds and makes him see things. In the second para, in second stanza, line 7 to 12, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw at glance, tossing their heads in spring sprightly dance. So here, this stanza describes the sight of daffodils. The flowers are compared to the stars in the Milky Way. The flowers are compared to the stars in a Milky Way. So Milky Way is a poetic expression for the sky when it's illuminated with stars. The sky illuminated with stars that look like a Milky Way. Like the stars, the daffodils are a countless multitude. They seem to be tossing their head in a lively dance. The poet calls the endless stretch of daffodils 10,000. This shows they are spread in a large number. 10,000 means not exact number. It shows the large number of flowers, daffodils, flowers. So in this stanza, the extension of the first stanza, the continuation of the first stanza, and then the twinkle connects to the golden of the first stanza. It emphasizes um, here in the brightness. The final word dance takes us back to the first stanza. Stanza 3, stanza 3, along the margin of a bay, 10,000 sad glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. Sparkling waves in glee. So in this stanza, the gauge is fixed. The gauge is fixed at the ground once again. Wordsworth here stresses the emotion behind the movement and brightness of the joy that the flowers display. The daffodils are not only linked with the stars and the heavens, but also with the waves on the lake. The dancing daffodils are set beside the dancing waves, but the waves are no comparison to the cheerfulness and the glee of the daffodils. In such a charming natural atmosphere, one cannot help being filled with joy. So the poet is happy because his mind is more active, imposing an order on things which were disorderly and pointless a short while ago. He is transported to the highest level of joy. He cannot take his eyes of the scene. In the next two lines, I gauged and gauged, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. So he does not realize at the moment what wealth the scene has given him. It is only later that memory recalls the scene and he narrates his experience in poetry. So in the last stanza, for oft when on my couch I lie, in a vacant or in a pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils, and dances with the daffodils. So in this last stanza, of course, the poet explains the wealth the shoe has brought to the poet. It suddenly appears in his mind whenever he lies in the bed. He recalls the whole experience in the state of absolute solitude. The recollection fills the poet minds with joy. Poet minds with joy. So here the poet once again makes two observations. Two observations. Firstly, the recollection of such a beautiful scene is possible only in loneliness. Firstly, the recollection of such a beautiful scene is possible only in a in loneliness. Only in the loneliness. So, and secondly, such a recollection fills the heart of the poet with pleasure, and it begins to dance with the daffodils. Note that, note that. So this bliss of solitude, yeah, bliss, is different from melancholy, and then loneliness described in the beginning of the poem. So flash up suggests movements and brightness, which are the two essential qualities of the daffodils. So some critical comments is that, so joy, when you see the author Wordsworth see the daffodils, he expressed the pleasure of degrees of pleasure are sprightly gay. So glee, jocund and bliss, the moment of the poem based on dance. It also explains the subject of the poem. It takes place in all the stanzas. The poem begins with the dance of the daffodils and ends with the dance of the poet's heart. So the daffodils, which are fluttering and dancing in the first stanza, toss their heads in a sprightly dance in the second stanza. So the third stanza refers to the dancing waves, and in the fourth and the final stanza, it is the poet's heart that dances. So Wordsworth called this scene a show implying that nature has deliberately set the stage for the experience of man. We find a similar suggestion in Titter, one of the important, other important poem of William Wordsworth. Also, this is how nature performs the role of a teacher for an art that watches and receives. So, it also explaining Wordsworth's conviction that seeing brings delight, wisdom, or instruction comes later when we are in a vacant or a serious mode. So, in this poem, the daffodils also illustrate Wordsworth's theory of poetic creation. According to Wordsworth, the conviction that seeing poetry is an expression of powerful feelings which recollected track. So, in this through this poem, Wordsworth gave a definition of poetry. What is poetry? According to Wordsworth, poetry is the expression of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Recollected in tranquility. He saw the scene of daffodils in the last 2 years. That means in 1802. He saw the scene of daffodils from the past 2 years, sorry, 1800. So he has seen the daffodils in 1802. But he wrote the poem in 1804. 1804. After recollecting the scene in imagination when he was enjoying his solitude or loneliness. So the daffodils thus effectively points out the importance of memory in preserving the scenes pursued through senses. So the poem also highlights the importance of poetic imagination, which transforms a seemingly ordinary incident. Seemingly ordinary incident. So, in this way, Wordsworth describes the flowers, daffodils, and explained through this poem, he gave the definition of poetry. Definition of poetry. It is about the poem Daffodils written by William Wordsworth. Next, we are discussing another poem prescribed for you, written by William Shakespeare. Is upon William Wordsworth is William, upon Westminster Bridge. Upon Westminster Bridge. So I already give the introduction about the author, brief introduction about the author. Now I am going to read the poem upon Westminster Bridge. Earth has not anything to glow, so more fair. Now we are discussing upon Westminster Bridge, another poem written by William Wordsworth that's prescribed for your first BA language. Earth has not anything to show, more fair. Dull would be of soul who could pass by. A sight so touching in its majesty, the city now dark like a garment where the beauty of the morning silent bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky. All bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did the sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor, valley, rock, or hill. Never saw I never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seen asleep, and all that mighty art is lying still. Lying still. So the Wordsworth, another poem upon Westminster Bridge. So the theme that dominates is that of nature. We knew that William Wordsworth was a nature poet. So this poem is also that dominates that nature. In fact, London is not introduced in its negative aspect, but it is inserted in a natural scenery. The author underlines above all the beauty of the city, not only describing the wild landscapes of the countries, but also the city monuments as the towers, the cathedrals, the theaters, and the temples. In Wordsworth's view, the air is clean and there is not smoke that blackened the walls of the church. In Wordsworth's view, the air is clean and there is not that smoke that blackened the walls of the church. As in Blake's composition, but only the light of the sun that illuminates the whole city. The poet transmits to the readers the calm and the tranquility described in his poem. In fact, in the poem, the readers' tranquility, there are not either sounds or noises, there is only silence. The poem written in the Petrarchan Sonnet form, so we knew that there are two kinds of sonnets. Sonnet is a poem of 14 lines. It is a kind of sonnet, Shakespearean sonnets and Petrarchan sonnets. It is in the form of a Petrarchan sonnet. So in this poem, the poet describes the beauty of London in the early morning, just when the sun rises. In this poem, London, the beauty of the London, the poet describes the beauty of the London in the early morning, just when the sun rises. We pursue the beauty of the city not so much through the description of what can we see, as through a sense of the admiration of the speaker. It is as if he's looking at a wonder, at something that cannot be but is still there. The sense of admiration is communicated through the development of a strange paradox, which states the impossible unity of two contradictory things. So, the London is an industrial city and also an organic beauty of nature, organic beauty of nature. So, this paradox of is introduced through the image of dress, with the rhymes of octave violet. The city is beautiful because it wears like a garment the natural beauty. London is a fair city because it's a beautiful city because it wears like a garment the natural beauty of the morning. Natural beauty of the morning. But wearing the beauty of the morning, in fact, means that the city is bare, means naked. What it wears is just the smokeless air. Just the smokeless air. So the paradox is carried over over and developed further in the sestet. Sestet means last 6 lines. Octave is first 8 lines. The connection with the dress metaphor is established through the image of the city being steeped in the light of the sun, and then the paradox is extended to the strange union of being dead or asleep, so and being alive. The paradox is extended to the strange union of being dead or alive or asleep and being alive. The city is now more beautiful and more alive than nature itself. The London city means London. The London city is now more beautiful and more alive than nature itself. But this is only so because it is steeped in the light of the sun and is thus deep asleep. Please mind it. But this is only to because it is steeped in the light of the sun and is thus deep asleep. The rhyming words steep and deep asleep. Steep, deep, and asleep. Steep, deep, and asleep. These are all rhyming words. Highlight these connections. This connection between steep, deep, asleep, as opposed to the city, which is lying still, the natural parts of the landscape, the sunlight, the valley, rock, or hill, as well as the river, are now active. The city, which is lying still, the natural parts of the landscape, the sunlight, the valley, the rock, or hill, as well as the river, are now active. They dominate over the sleeping city, as is emphasized by the rhyming words ill, will, still. Rhyming words like in the last lines I said, steep, deep, asleep are highlight these connections. Here, ill, will, lying still. Words ill, at their will, lying still. The city represented in the last line by the metaphor of the art is thus alive because it is dead, because it is inactive, and is dominated by its natural environment. So, the thematic development of the poem is beautifully ended by the rhymes, the enjambments. In the octave expresses the boundless admiration for this beautiful sight, the overflowing emotion of the speaker. This is further emphasized by the fact that although the lines of the Petrarchan Sonnet, so the upon the Westminster Bridge is the Petrarchan Sonnet form. English should be iambic pentameters, even where the rhymes gets very close to this. So one function of this metrical development is clearly to mark the end of the poem. Apart from this, however, the clear iambic rhythm also functions here on another level by the sound effect. It creates, it contradicts the explicit verbal meaning of the line which it appears. So the city here, while the line says that mighty heart of the city is lying still, the iambic rhythm gives us a strong sense of the beating of a heart. Thus, the paradox that is developed all through the poem reaches its final statement in this line. The city is now lying still. It is dead. It is not itself. It is dominated by the natural environment. And it is precisely because of this that it can come to life. The mighty heart begins to beat only when it is lying still. When it is lying still. When it is lying still. So, and then the conclusion of the poem is upon the Westminster Bridge. In this first 8 lines, the author gives no other scene is more beautiful on the earth than the sight of London. In the first 8 lines, the author explain London is more beautiful on the earth in the morning sun. He who is not touched by such a majestic and impressive scene is indeed dull of soul. The city of London has clothed itself in the bright light of the morning as a garment. There are no signs of its noisy people and their buzzing activities. Ships, towers, domes, theaters, and churches can be clearly seen spreading into the open fields. There is nothing now to hide the view of these wide fields and a clear sky overhead. All these objects look bright and shining because the air is free of smoke. In the last just 6 lines, the rays of the sun had never shone more beautiful over the valleys, rocks, and hills in all those country scenes. The poet, though, had visited many scenes earlier, never before had the poet experienced such intense quietness as at this time. The river Thames flows on the flows in the London. And the river Thames flows freely without being disturbed by the activities of boats, ships, and sailors. Addressing God, the poet rejoices that the houses and their occupants are now at rest. It feels as though the mighty heart of London city has stopped beating and it is lying calm and still. So, in this sonnet, Wordsworth revolves the great city of London, not as full of noise and dust and confusion, but as something silent, grand, and everlasting. Wordsworth here also comes out as a poet of solitude. All solitary things have an extraordinary fascination for him. He is impressed by the pure, clear air, splendor, and the partly rural character. of the city. But what impresses him the most is its stillness, as he says. So the using language and is simple in the sonnets and natural. It is true to typical Wordsworthian poetic diction. Wordsworth has personified the sun, the city, and the river. Must also note the use of simile in like garment. Wordsworth employs metaphor in the last line of the sonnet when he tries the city of London as a mighty art. Mighty art. Already told it's a Petrarchan model sonnet. It's a sonnet of Petrarchan Sonnet, and first eight lines picturize the scene where the state last sixth line describes the influence on the poet's mind. So it is about the poem upon Westminster Bridge, written by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth. In the next class, we are discussing some other topic in the next classes. Okay, bye. Thank you.